Well, good evening, Forest Mill. Hope you're doing well tonight, having a blessed week. We are thankful that we have made it through the election and hope that it all went well for you and that you're safe and sound. And now we just are sort of awaiting the results, and we continue to pray for the best. And as always, we trust God's hand in leading us where we ought to be, regardless of the outcome, whether it suits our particular understanding or not. But here we are, and we're sort of beginning a new chapter. And we're doing the same thing in the book of Psalms. Now, we've just finished up book 3 of Psalms, and traditionally they have been broken up into sections or books, and then each book will contain a number of Psalms, either thematically arranged or by age or for events. But we've now come to book 4. And book 4 begins with Psalm 90. That's where we're going to be tonight. Now, Psalm 90 is, we believe, the oldest psalm in all of the Psalms. It was written by Moses. So it was far before the kingdom of Israel was established, and far long before David and the temple singers and those under King Solomon. So this is an old psalm, and it deals with some themes that kind of continue to pop up throughout really all of humanity. This is a big, wide sweeping psalm that deals with issues of life and death, about what it's like to live, what it means to live, what the experience of living with God is like, what it is for mortal and fallible human beings to serve an immortal and infallible God. So it's really powerful. It's a little bit longer. It's not as long as, of course, some of the Psalms that we'll be getting into as we go along, but it's still a little bit longer than many of the Psalms we've been looking at. And we believe that this psalm, based on kind of some of the things that's said in it, it might have been after the failure of the Israelite people at Kadesh Barnea. And you remember that was their most spectacular failure when they first arrived at the Promised Land and didn't believe that they were capable, didn't believe God was capable of leading them to successfully take the land, to take the Promised Land. And so it was then God sentenced them to another 40 years in the wilderness. This had to have been an incredibly difficult time for Moses. Not only do you have the death, the death of the dream, entering the Promised Land, but then you have the death of Moses' sister, Miriam, and the death of Moses' brother, Aaron. And in that span of time, Moses also sinned when he struck the rock, when God commanded him to speak to the rock. So despite all of that, this weight sort of bearing down on Moses, and maybe you've been in a time of life like that, Moses is still considered a man of God. Time and time again, we're reminded of Moses' relationship with God, how he lived and walked with God. And that's really interesting. How did Moses manage to become a man of God after 40 years spent in Egypt, which culminated in a failure when Moses murdered a man? Then 40 years lived in almost seclusion, an isolated life as a shepherd in Midian. And then follow that by 40 years of leading the Israelites on what amounted to a long death march, since the entire first generation would be walking to their deaths. So, despite all of this, how is Moses still considered a man of God? So life for Moses was definitely not easy, and yet he triumphed in a way that sometimes we may fail to take notice of. It's easy to overlook how Moses succeeded in being a man of God. So in this particular psalm, it's like Moses is sharing this life experience, this insight, this wealth of knowledge of what it means to live with and walk with God. So this is kind of life in a nutshell from Moses' perspective. So let's begin just by reading the first couple of verses. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This is just a beautiful sentiment in opening this particular psalm. But Moses is essentially saying that we as human beings, we are our pilgrims. We are always journeying. From birth to death is a journey. Alone, I mean, if you go back and you read about the journey of the Israelites in the wilderness, in one chapter, we're given 40 different places that they spent the night, right? They had no permanent dwelling whatsoever, constantly moving from place to place. So how could Moses find any peace? And it's because he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place. That no matter where he was, whether he was growing up in an Egyptian household, tending sheep out in the wilderness of Midian, or traveling in the wilderness with thousands of hungry, grumpy, disobedient, ungrateful former Egyptian slaves, that in that traveling, even Moses can find peace because he recognized that God was his dwelling place. So for 80 years, Moses had lived a somewhat settled life, right? He spent the first 40, of course, in Egypt, and then the next 40 in Midian. But then he spent these last 40 years of his life traveling in the wilderness with people who didn't always appreciate his leadership. They were complainers, and so here Moses is looking for or is explaining that, even in these circumstances, he could live in the Lord. He could abide in the Lord, that he could find strength and encouragement and comfort to meet each day's demands. And if you think about what the daily demands of life in the wilderness must have been like, it's pretty overwhelming. I mean, just imagine getting enough food and water for all of those people, right? They were blessed in that God provided those things time and again, but you're surrounded by desert largely, and certainly the wilderness, unsettled places. So in just providing roof over people's head, a place for them to lay down at night, warmth when the nights grew cold, relief from the heat when the days grew hot, food and water. And then you've got all of the disputes that were happening among the people. All of that falls onto Moses' shoulders. Every day he wakes up to deal with that set of problems. It makes most of our lives look pretty tame by comparison. Most of our problems rather small. And yet, even with this tremendous weight on him, he could commune with God. He could live in the Lord. This is kind of the Old Testament equivalent of what John says in John 15 when Jesus gives the "Abide in Me" talk. That it's about making the Lord our dwelling. That the homes we live in, the part of the country we live in, the country that we live in, right? Those are not our home. That if I and my family were suddenly thrust into another place in this world, we were told or chose to live in a country where maybe we didn't speak the language, where the customs were radically different, and everything was harder. how would we make it? And I think for our part, we would have to find this resting place, this abiding in the Lord. Now, Moses here addresses God as Elohim, which is one of the oldest words for God. It's the God of power. It's the creator God. He describes God as giving birth to the mountains and entirely forming the world. That was the ancient Israelite worldview, that God shaped and molded the world, much like a potter might do with clay, that God had done that with everything. And often they reference the mountains. And of course, other ancient Near Eastern religions recognize the mountains as significant. But for the Israelites, they had a special place because they symbolized the power of God, right? The permanence of God, the dependability of God. A mountain is still a mountain, whether you are standing at the foot of it, or your son, or your grandson, or your great grandmother. Right now, everyone looks at the same mountain. It's always there, and that was the way they thought about God, that He was always there. And there'd been all these generations between Abraham and Moses. I think 6 generations between Abraham and Moses, and yet God had been the same God, guiding generation after generation after generation. So the Deuteronomy 33:27 says, "The eternal God is your refuge and dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms." So that's how Moses opens this psalm, with this prayer of praise. Next, we're going to read verses 3 through 12, which looks really at our own mortality. Beginning at verse 3, Moses says, "You turn people back to dust, saying, 'Return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that's just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass in the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it's dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and are terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. Yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." So in the first part, we might say Moses was describing our lives as pilgrims. We are pilgrims and God is our home. For this part, we're more described like learners. We are learners, and life is the school. Moses was educated in the way of the Egyptians. We know from the stories about his life that he was taught all that they could teach. But in a lot of ways, he didn't learn about life until much later. He may have had a lot of knowledge, but it wasn't knowledge about life with God. That it took some time alone with God, some sheep tending in the wilderness, literally in his case. And it was these life lessons that were really being put to the test now. The lessons that he learned from walking with God were far more important than any learning he might have gotten in school. So in the school of life, Moses would say, we need to learn 2 lessons. One, life is brief. And 2, that it passes swiftly. That's what we need to learn about life. We are only given a very minute window of opportunity to live before the everlasting God. Even a long life, 70, 80 years, Moses said, a long life. Even that's just a watch in the night. just a just a brief moment in the history that of mankind, and nothing before the everlasting God, right? If there were no sin and no death, like there will be one day in God's eternal kingdom, then our lives would not be so brief, right? They would be as eternal as the God who'd made them. But because of sin and death, our lives are short. And as Moses notes here, most often they're hard years. We are so fortunate in our country and in our culture and in much of the world to have so many conveniences, right? We have the ability to keep the temperature the temperature we want it to be on the inside of our homes and inside of our cars. We have nice, comfy seats and couches to sit on, plenty of food, and the ability to get food readily, and so many more luxuries in between. The ability to get around in a motorized vehicle, right? That's all luxuries. We have all of that thing, and even with all of these luxuries, we would sometimes we'd say, well, yeah, life for us is easy, and yet it doesn't feel that easy. It's still hard. It's hard to be, for me, a good husband the way I'm called to be, and a good father. It's hard for me to live the life as a son of God that I ought to. There's physical pain some days. There's emotional pain a lot of days. There's heartache and there is struggle. There's fear and worry. Right? We lose those we love, whether to death or the destruction of a relationship, and that loss we mourn. All right, life is hard, even with all of our luxuries. Life is difficult, and Moses is recognizing this, that we begin as dust and we end as dust, and it is a brief moment in between. Sometimes in our culture, we just fail to acknowledge death. We try to ignore it for as long as possible and keep ourselves as separated from death as possible. So if someone dies, then we don't take care of that. We don't look after the dead. We want to be removed from that. We have other people to take care of that. Other places they can go. The dead are not in our homes, right? We just sort of put it to the back of our minds, and we tell ourselves that it's not me, it's not me. But in truth, all of us will face death. One day soon or one day later, we all face death. So life is brief and death is sure. And the lessons that we need to learn in this life are, we are only given limited opportunities. So in a way, Moses is arguing that as difficult as life is, those are lessons. There are lessons in there that we have to learn to be prepared for eternity. That we don't learn those lessons when everything goes well. We don't learn those lessons when it all comes easy. When I was in school, as a elementary, junior high school, for the most part, most of my studies were, I didn't have a very difficult time. Learning for me was pretty easy. But then I got to college, and all of a sudden I'm surrounded by a lot of other people for whom learning is easy. And then there are people for whom learning was work. And we get in college and we are giving classes that is work. And the people who have worked to learn all along have built up study habits and some discipline to manage the workload. And for me, I was having to build those things on the fly. I was not good at it at all. If I'd had more struggle, if my high school had been more rigorous, or if I had taken more challenging classes, perhaps I might have been forced to learn those lessons before I got thrown into the deep end of the pool. Well, essentially, that's what life is. It is a series of hard things that we have to learn. We have to go through struggle to learn the lessons we need to shape us for eternity. We are not yet fit, are not yet suited, are not yet built for eternity with God. And so it takes difficult lessons in life. So in verses 7 through 11, Moses talks a lot about God's anger. And again, likely this is a reflection on the failure of the Israelites at Kadesh Barnea when they did not seize upon God's word and go in and take the promised land. And what a sad and difficult experience that has been, Moses reflects. How hard it is to live under the scrutiny of God's wrath. That there is nothing that we have said or done that can be hidden, right? He says, God, you just take all our sin, big public, well-known sins and little private, tiny sins, and you just take them all and you set them right before you. Oh, have you ever turned in work, whether it was in school or at work or a project you've been doing, and you have to bring it and set it before someone, and you just know it does not measure up to the standards, that it's just not good. It's not even my best, certainly not equal to their best. What Moses is saying is like, we bring our ugliest accomplishments and they're placed right before the face of a holy God to look upon. It is mortifying to know that God looks upon our greatest, our most private, our most secretive sins, that those are sitting before his face. And so he's looking around at them, and he understands why they are having to wander in the wilderness, why life is so difficult. It's because their sin is sitting before God. And let's finish up and look at verses 13 through 17. Relent, Lord, how long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So, like many psalmists that we've read previously in Psalm, Moses asks the question, how long? How long are we going to suffer under your anger? How long are we going to have to live with your wrath? And he is asking for compassion. He's asking for a God to let up, right? For God to relent. And then he says, satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. And I can't help but think that has to be a reference to the providence of God while they were in the wilderness, where every morning there was manna, right? And what Moses is asking for is not just the daily bread, but for God's unfailing love, for God's anger to relent, and for them to live for him in satisfaction, full and whole and complete. What a beautiful prayer for us to go to bed each night and wake up each morning asking to be fed on the unfailing love of God. And he points to their difficulties, their struggles, and yet there is throughout this entire section a note of hope that is looking towards the future. He believes that it will not always be this way. As hard as it is right now, it won't always be this way. So if we were learners and life was our school there in the middle, now he's pointing out that we are believers and the future is our hope. That we are always pointing towards a God of resolution, a God of justice, a God of satisfaction. that things will be made right and we will be made right before him. Now, this is not the same thing as the sort of the eternal optimism that existed in the first half of the 20th century, where many in our culture and other Western cultures pointed out how the world was just getting better and better, and eventually we're just going to get it all right. We've come to a point in our existence now in the early 21st century that we see, no matter how much good we're accomplishing, that there's always a great deal of bad out there being accomplished as well. And that even when we do good things with the best of intentions, there are oftentimes dire consequences that were unforeseen, that there are ramifications we just could never have imagined. Right? And so for Moses to have an optimism about the future, it's not about his optimism that Israel is going to get it all right, that we're going to get it all figured out, and we're all going to be good one day. And no, this is an optimism that God is merciful and just. And as believers, that is our great hope, that our God is both merciful and just. And he asks in his final prayer there is just, may the favor of the Lord God rest on us. And his prayer is for God to establish the work of our hands. It was like he kind of just didn't even, it's almost like Moses didn't know how to ask for what he wanted. How do you word what he's trying to say is that things will work out for them. And so he just sort of sums it up by saying, just establish the work of our hands. Let the good that we're trying to do endure. May our lives have an effect, not just on us, but on our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. May the things we say and do be a blessing for years and generations to come. Establish the work of our hands. What a great prayer to end with. That's my prayer for you this week, for us as the Forest Mill Church of Christ, that we may be a people who live under the mercy and justice of God, and that we may live in such a way that God will establish the work of our hands. And may God bless you, Forest Mill, tonight, and may God bless the study of his word.